Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Kevin Nuckolls. I'm a Pappalardo fellow here at MIT with Joe Czajkowski. And today I'm excited to share with you a new paper that my teammates and I published in Nature, where we've chemically designed Moiré superlattices in bulk crystals. And we've used these Moiré crystals to access signatures of higher dimensional physics in the laboratory. So I've actually written this talk in the form of 3 short stories. And so before we jump into those experiments, I'll first tell you about an interesting old proposal from Johannes Kepler about the possibility of higher dimensional snowflakes. I'll then show you how similar curiosities have arisen naturally in our understanding of crystal formation. And then I'll tell you about this new work, which essentially uses Moiré crystals as a way to combine some of these old ideas in new, interesting ways. So the main character for our first story will be Johannes Kepler, who, as all of you know, has made really foundational contributions to mathematics and astronomy. Kepler did most of his most impactful work in the early 1600s. And at that time, he was good friends with a man named Johannes Matthias Wacker von Wachenfeld. Now, von Wachenfeld was a science enthusiast, someone who Kepler could talk through ideas with, and he was a really important benefactor of Kepler's work during his most impactful years of research. So the story is set in 1610, and this was a huge year for astronomy and a really busy year for Kepler, such that even though it's December of this year, Kepler doesn't have any gifts for anyone in his life. And so the story goes, on the snowy day in Prague, Kepler is walking around contemplating what he might get for his friend von Wachenfeld. And the story goes, he crosses the Charles Bridge in sort of a quiet and introspective moment. A snowflake falls upon his lapel that he recognizes has 6-fold symmetry. So Kepler continues onwards, but now captivated by this deceptively simple question. Why do snowflakes have 6-fold symmetry? In the coming weeks, Kepler would write a brief treatise on the matter, and that this would be his gift to von Wachenfeld. So Kepler proposes here that perhaps the snowflakes we observe in nature, they're not actually 6-fold symmetric, but instead they could be projections of higher dimensional, 3-dimensional snowflakes that he calls 6-cornered snowflakes. Now, Kepler has some detailed model for how these occur in nature, but really crucially, Kepler believes that 6-fold symmetry could be a direct result of this 3-cornered snowflake branching outwards in each of the 3 spatial dimensions of our reality. So as the snowflake, it kind of tumbles, it lands, it collapses under its own weight, therefore projecting itself into 6-fold symmetry. So today we know this is not correct, like not even close. But I still share this proposal, this story, because I think it's we can admire the simplicity of Kepler's proposal, and to further recognize that the essence of Kepler's curiosity has pervaded both physics and philosophy today. In essence, I distill as follows. Could the patterns that we see in nature, could they be shadows or projections of a rich but hidden higher dimensional reality? And so today I want to tell you about how some of these same curiosities have entered very naturally in our understanding of crystal formation of a certain class of materials that we'll call aperiodic lattice materials. Good. So we're going to shift gears now and talk very broadly about crystal formation. And we're going to do so using a simplified model of tiling. So the goal here is I want to cover the 2-dimensional plane with simple polygons such that there are no gaps. And so for example, this is the carbon lattice of graphene. And you might imagine representing this carbon lattice using this simple hexagonal tiling, where atoms would sit at the vertices of this tiling. So ancient Greek philosophers told us exactly how to tile the 2-dimensional plane with regular polygons, those with equal side lengths. And we can use some of these simplified models to better understand how might a material that has a periodic lattice, how might this crystallize in nature? So consider this thought experiment. I have some finite hexagonal crystal, and I want to add a couple more atoms to extend the crystal a little bit. Then what are the ways in which I can do this? I think it's very intuitive that option A and option B are valid extensions of this crystal, but that option C, where I place a tile directly right of an existing one, but this is invalid because it creates these gaps that I can't remove when I add extra atoms. Think, though, if this were square tiling, that I could put a square tile directly right of an existing one. And so this tells me that the shape of the tile is important for its construction, or more specifically, that the symmetries of a crystal lattice provide rules for its formation. This is a very generalizable principle we can take going forward. So in general, real materials in the world do not always take periodic lattices. Very importantly, Moiré materials don't have periodic lattices. But we can approximate, or we can model some of these structures using so-called aperiodic tilings, which again cover the plane, but now don't do so in a regularly repeating manner. So a famous example of this is the so-called Penrose tiling, made up of these 2 fundamental building blocks, this kite-shaped tile and this dart-shaped tile. And so take the same example as before, but with this Penrose crystal. I have a finite Penrose crystal, and I want to add a couple more atoms to it in order to extend the lattice. I want you to take a look very closely at what these symmetries are and to guess for yourself. I'll actually take an informal poll, and we'll vote on which options we think are valid extensions of this crystal. And if you don't know what you're looking for, just guess. Use your gut instinct. What do you feel is the right answer? So option A for today is to add this dart over to the left side. Or option B will be to add this kite onto the right side. Perhaps both are reasonable options. OK, let's vote. Give it your best shot. And raise your hand if you think that option A is a valid extension of the crystal. Excellent. How many of you think option B is a valid extension of the crystal? Good, good, good. And how many of you think both of them are valid extensions? Excellent. No, this was great. It's almost an even spread of votes. So this is a really illustrative example, because in this example, option A is a valid extension. Option B is also a valid extension. But option A and B together is somehow not a valid extension. This is very perplexing. This is very strange. It seems to be that the options A and B are mutually exclusive, one or the other, but not both. And more unintuitive is that the gap that you form, that you can't get rid of, you can't tile the infinite plane, it forms down here, completely non-local, to where you added all these atoms, which, if we think back to the periodic tiling for periodic lattices, this is very unintuitive to me. And so what I offer to you is you can actually buy these tiles online, and you can try to assemble them yourself in order to figure out what's going wrong, what gives here. And so by going through this process, you'll find that the rules for aperiodic tiling are terribly unintuitive, but they're strict. And so what people typically do is they tile some region, they get to an impasse where there's a break, and then they have to remove a bunch of tiles in order to make a way for new tiles. So this beckons the question, if aperiodic tiling is dictated by the symmetries of those tilings, then what are the symmetries of, and therefore the rules for aperiodic tiling? I'll also remind you that we're using this as a simplified model for crystal formation. And so we'll want to say something about the materials that are describable by aperiodic tilings, so-called incommensurate materials, or aperiodic crystals. How would these form in nature? It may come as a surprise to you, but we can grow these types of materials, aperiodic crystals, in the lab under very precise conditions. But we can also excavate them from the Earth's crust. And in both scenarios, nature knows exactly where to place all of the atoms, even though the order is hidden to you and me. So this puzzle perplexed people for many years. But a powerful new perspective was introduced in the 1970s when physicists recognized that aperiodic crystals are not actually aperiodic, but instead they can be understood as projections of higher dimensional, 4, 5, or 6-dimensional lattices that we call superspace crystals. Now, even the superspace crystals live in higher dimensional superspace. They're a lot like regular crystals because they're highly symmetric and they're perfectly periodic. Really crucially, if I take a very thin slice of this superspace crystal, I can produce any incommensurate lattice we find in nature. This is a powerful perspective that gives us a feeling for why incommensurate materials might be stable in nature, how we should actually describe their long-range order, and how they diffract under things like electron irradiation or X-ray radiation, how they show up in real experiments. And so with this superspace picture in mind, I want to bring us up to the present day, and I'll introduce you to this new work that my teammates and I published that reports a new family of aperiodic crystals. And we'll find that the electrons in these Moiré crystals appear to inherit their dimensionality from that higher dimensional superspace. So I think people in this audience are quite well aware that we're living at an exciting time of materials research with the discovery of Moiré materials, which have really revolutionized how we design and control quantum phases of matter. So these materials are designed through either rotational or lattice mismatches between 2D crystals, which produce these intricate interference patterns, which give rise to these long wavelength Moiré superlattices. And really crucially, these materials have these Moiré superlattices that are tunable and admit new and tunable properties in 2D materials. So nearly all reports to date have generated experimentally these Moiré materials using a tool called the van der Waals transfer station, which is an exceptional tool of condensed matter research, because it allows me to mix and match, twist and stack 2D materials into Moiré material devices, as used by the Herrero, the Ashuri, and the Jew group here at MIT. So this is an exceptional tool because it's highly versatile. Essentially any 2D material that I can exfoliate down to thin flakes, I can twist it and incorporate it into a Moiré material device. It's also generalizable. If I have a Moiré material that has multiple twisted interfaces, I just pick up more materials and incorporate them into the stack. And so this has been a really essential tool for 2D research. But today, my teammates and I have introduced a conceptually new approach to designing high-quality Moiré materials using the tools of solid-state chemistry to stabilize those crystals as well as tune their lattice properties. So this offers us kind of a conceptually orthogonal but complementary approach to generating Moiré materials using the high-temperature chemical synthesis of bulk van der Waals crystals. So the idea is we're going to take some elemental precursors that we can buy online. We're going to react them in high-temperature furnaces like this one that gets up to 1200 degrees Celsius. And we're going to grow van der Waals crystals, new materials. These are layered crystals that have Moiré superlattices built into their layers. And so the key advantages of an approach like this is first that the Moiré superlattices that we can stabilize are going to be highly homogeneous because we're stabilizing them deep within thermodynamic equilibrium. In addition, because we're growing these crystals in big batches, this represents a potentially scalable route for generating Moiré materials for next generation electronic technology. And then perhaps it goes without saying, but we've seen time and time again over many decades of materials research that when new materials are introduced, discovered, that they offer us a conduit to new physics. And so because these Moiré superlattices are new in bulk crystal research, these Moiré crystals will be of no exception to this time-tested paradigm. Excellent. So these are pictures of these Moiré crystals that I discovered. They are layered crystals, and they contain strontium, tantalum, and sulfur. And so we'll first want to understand what are the lattice structures of these Moiré crystals. I found actually that it's a little hard to understand that Moiré structure of these black shiny rocks on first pass. But it's a little easier when we take this in analogy. So these Moiré crystals are maybe a little bit unfamiliar, but we can think of them as akin to a much more familiar three-dimensional object, this AI-generated ham sandwich. So Moiré crystals, just like ham sandwiches, they have different layers, and they kind of modulate against one another. And if I want to know what's in this ham sandwich, I would just chop it open. I would cut it open and expose its layers. So in our analogy, this is akin to electron microscopy in order to directly image the cross-section and look at the different layers atomically of these Moiré crystals. So in collaboration with our collaborators at Harvard, we chopped these Moiré crystal sandwiches and exposed their layers to atomically resolve the layer structure of these Moiré crystals. So you can see this crystal grows in layers where there are these bright layers that are tantalum disulfide. This is a very clean two-dimensional metal. We see these layers here are separated, though, by these interstitial monolayers of strontium-6, tantalum-sulfur 8. So the idea here is that this crystal grows as this perfectly shuffled deck of cards. And the shuffled deck of cards is made of two different monolayers that are lattice mismatched, that they have an irrational relationship between their lattice constants. And so this produces a lot of stress that's relieved in the crystal in the form of a Moiré modulation, in exactly the same geometry as we do so in 2D Moiré materials. And so you can see this modulation of about 3.5 nanometers. This is exactly the Moiré superlattice. And this is a direct image of it in this crystal. So this is a good perspective, this side profile. But another interesting perspective is to take a top-down approach and to look at peeling back the layers of these Moiré crystal sandwiches to understand what does that in-plane Moiré superlattice look like. So this would be akin to, essentially the X-ray diffraction probes we used in order to extract lattice constants, to extract relative lattice parameters, and to simulate the lattice structure in plane. So here's a simulation of X-ray diffraction. This is a good example of one of these Moiré crystals that we discovered. And we're simulating the tantalum disulfide in blue, the strontium-6 tantalum sulfur 8 in pink, and then when they overlap with one another, it produces white light. So you can see this crystal is aperiodic. It doesn't have a unit cell. And it's typified by this very simple one-dimensional Moiré superlattice here. So certain regions of chemical phase space stabilize structures like this, but other regions stabilize more quasi-two-dimensional Moiré superlattices that can have lattice mismatches in both the x and the y direction. So an important insight of our work was to recognize that these Moiré crystals have lattices that have clear representations in higher dimensional superspace. So to show you that construction very clearly, I've zoomed in to one of these Moiré superlattices where you can see that the orange and the purple lattices are incommensurate. They don't share a unit cell. I can't draw in 4 dimensions, but I can draw in 2 dimensions. And so let's isolate this one-dimensional line cut of a one-dimensional Moiré superlattice. I argue through superspace construction that this 1D line cut of a 1D Moiré is equivalent to this 1 + 1 dimensional superspace crystal. To show you this carefully, I've identified the physical dimension, and I've actually elevated this incommensurate lattice into one higher superspace dimension. And then when I cut from superspace and project into physical space, I recover the Moiré superlattice. So this gives us a feeling that the Moiré crystals that we're dealing with have all of the same lattice ingredients of a model that lives in higher dimensional superspace. And so we'll ask the question, could it be that the electronic properties of an aperiodic crystal would know about superspace? They would inherit their dimensionality from superspace. So we did a bunch of different types of experiments, but the ones most prominently featured in our paper were magnetic signatures of superspace. So here's a picture of our experiment. This is called torque magnetometry. And it starts with us affixing a Moiré crystal to the end of a flexible silicon nitride cantilever, and then placing this object into a magnetic field. So the overall idea is that electrons in metals in a magnetic field, they undergo cyclotron orbits. They start to orbit. And they'll do so according to quantum mechanics at very specific energies called Landau levels. So as I vary the magnetic field, those Landau levels get populated and unpopulated, which oscillates the magnetization of this crystal, which causes this cantilever to deflect back and forth. And so if I can measure very specifically these small cantilever deflections, I can learn a lot about the electronic states, the available electronic behaviors in this crystal. So here's a measurement that we included in our paper. This is the torque magnetization, which is similar to, but not quite, the magnetization of the crystal. And you can see it oscillates due to Landau levels up to very high magnetic fields, as available to us at the National High Magnetic Field Lab in Tallahassee, Florida. So this is a really complicated spectrum. There are lots of different oscillation frequencies or different types of electronic behaviors that convolve in this behavior, in this signal. And so a classic tool that physicists use to decompose this is to use the Fourier transform, to decompose it into its constituent frequencies. So when we Fourier transform signals like this, we find a dense cascade of sharp oscillation frequencies, many, many different types of electronic orders, electronic behaviors in this crystal. So by closely analyzing many signatures like this across many different types of Moiré crystals, we were able to isolate some really interesting features of the data. And one of the most interesting ones was the fact that the frequencies in Fourier space seem to be linearly spaced. They're all really well ordered in frequency, which is a signature we've never seen before in the literature. So to explain this particular observation and many others that make the data kind of anomalous, we worked very closely with theory colleagues here at MIT. So this is Nishar Gopal, Filippo Gaggioli, and Liang Fu. And together we came up with a simplified model for understanding the linear frequency comb that we observed in experiment and their anomalous temperature dependence, which we couldn't find representation from in previous literature. And this theory essentially has two different ways to think about this problem, but they come to the same conclusion. And so we'll walk through some of the broad ideas of this. So on one hand, our theory colleagues were able to use the standard formalism for understanding quantum oscillations as we do so in literally any metal. So this formalism is called Lifshitz-Kossovich theory. It doesn't matter the details, but it's kind of the standard approach that you would walk through. And we just blindly calculate. And so when you get to the end of this calculation, you find the results look a lot like our experiment. They explain the linear frequency comb. They have similar temperature dependence to what we're looking for. And what they describe are Moiré scattered orbits, essentially. So the electron is moving in this Moiré crystal, and it can scatter off of integer quanta of the Moiré superlattice. But scattering is kind of a, in quotes, term because it's not really scattering. It has some very strange properties that I can say something about, but I think it's not so important. So scattering, it seemed like something was hidden from us when we did this calculation. So this is one approach. It gives us the right answer for understanding our measurements. But an alternate approach was to recognize that hidden in the mathematics of that calculation was the material's four-dimensional lattice. That we found that what looked like in this rigorous calculation to be simulated orbits of a four-dimensional superspace metal, as if I had done four-dimensional measurements in a 4D metal. And what we're looking at are effectively projections of the physical observables from 4D orbits down into 3 dimensions. And so this offers us a perspective that perhaps Moiré crystals can be thought of as perfect simulators of some of the properties of higher dimensional quantum materials, because the electrons in these crystals appear to inherit their dimensionality from this higher dimensional lattice. So I'm wrapping up here. I'll share a little bit of outlook, but just to say that my teammates and I think this is really only the beginning. And we think that there are many opportunities for us to use aperiodic crystals to simulate higher dimensional physical phenomena. So there's some interesting open proposals in the literature, open theoretical proposals for higher dimensional topological phases, which can have interesting bulk boundary correspondences, or to have higher dimensional superconducting phases that can break higher dimensional point group symmetries. We think that some of these proposals can be realized if we can design and discover aperiodic crystals that are right for the job. And so I'm wrapping up. I just want to say thank you for your time and thank the people responsible. Thank you to Alan Chen. We work very closely with one another in the lab of Joe Chikelski. Thank you to Nisharga, Filippo, and Liang. And many thanks to, for the past 3 years of support, both personally and professionally, from Neil Pappalardo, from Jane Pappalardo, from the Pappalardo Fellowships, and from this MIT community. Thank you.
Okay, floor is open for questions.
Hi.
Thank you for the beautiful talk. Really enjoyed that. A couple of questions. Simple one. Is your compound superconducting?
I don't have any public comments to make on that right now. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, fair enough, fair enough. Yeah, because in early days, Joe and I was looking at the copper doped one and find it superconducting.
It's an interesting question, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'll leave that to you guys. Yeah. Now, of course, the challenging question about the evenly space, right? A standard interpretation would be this is a magnetic breakdown or interference pattern,
excellent,
right?
excellent, yeah.
So, and the thing to check is if the orbital size scale with the mass.
Excellent, yes.
Did you try?
Yeah. Let's look. Yeah.
Thank
It's
you.
an excellent insight. So let me go to the Condensed Matter seminar now. Yeah, so what Lou has pointed out absolutely aptly is the notion that there are many non-Onsager mechanisms, many existing mechanisms in the literature for producing more frequencies than there are Fermi pockets in this metal. So to explain perhaps a complicated Fermi surface, a complicated Moiré metal, then we would think that maybe the effective mass, so the temperature dependence of quantum oscillations, might isolate this. And so here's a plot of the effective mass normalized by the bare effective mass as a function of the frequency of the peak that we observed. And you can see that it's roughly, slowly varying essentially. So essentially, with magnetic breakdown, typically I'd have two Fermi pockets. They're very close to one another. And at high fields, I can tunnel between these Fermi pockets and enclose the mass, or enclose the composition of those pockets. And so from magnetic breakdown, we would expect this structure to kind of skyrocket up to 45 bare effective masses or plummet down to 1/45. And so this is kind of, it is increasing, but I think it's increasing at a very, very slow rate as a function of many, many frequencies. And so we have a bunch of kind of microscopic models for trying to explain this with simple Brillouin zone folding, but they always give you some effective mass that just runs away. And so I think this is a good measure, a good diagnostic to do. The linear spacing as a function of frequency and peak index, this is also pointing us in the right direction of that it's likely related to superspace instead. Yeah, good.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. This is a theorist question, so I'm sorry in advance. But so Merman-Wagner says that you can't have continuous symmetry breaking at finite temperatures in 2D. For these aperiodic systems, does the fact that you're sort of in some higher dimension let you get around that, or is there any other sort of flavor of like, oh, there's this thing that we can't normally do in 2D, but because this can be thought of as some higher dimensional system, we somehow get around that? Like, is there any?
That's very interesting. Yeah, what order are you asking about? These form or this higher dimensional picture? Like, what is prevented from Merman-Wagner?
Like the continuous symmetry breaking at finite temperature.
Just that it crystallizes.
Oh no, of like ferromagnetism or something like that.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I think in experiment we see a lot of ways to navigate around Merman-Wagner. Maybe I'll say some broad features, but Merman-Wagner is perfectly isotropic. So if I have some anisotropy, Merman-Wagner also prevents infinite flakes of graphene. But if my sample is finite, then I get around Merman-Wagner. I don't have to integrate out to infinity.
I see.
And so I think that all these situations, all of 2D order, ferromagnetism and chromium triiodide, these types of things get around these by the assumptions of Merman-Wagner. But yes, it's an interesting question, though. Yeah.
Other questions?
It's okay.
Yeah. So when explaining aperiodic lattices, I think you mentioned the higher dimensional crystal, and a cross section is the reality, the thing that you see in the aperiodic lattice. So my question is, for aperiodic lattices in general, or in your material, is the corresponding higher dimensional material is uniquely defined, or I mean, like, is there like a one-to-one relations between them? Because so the question is, can we view it as a underlying reality, or can we view it as should we view it as a framework that can explain this aperiodic lattices?
Yeah. It's an excellent question. So the uniqueness of higher dimensions given the encoding in lower dimensions. So I don't know if it is perfectly unique if we include things like trivial expansions. But it seems, the superspace constructions that I know of give pretty distinctive cuts through a superspace crystal that I can't generate the same information in a different way. So one way that I like thinking about this, actually, Alan and I, my collaborator and friend in the lab, we talk about this, is that this incommensurate lattice, it almost has infinite information. It's not just a two-dimensional periodic lattice, but it knows a lot about exactly the aliasing of this lattice. And so it has enough information to encode something that lives in 3 dimensions or 4 dimensions. Whether or not, I think that we'd have to think more carefully. And I don't know of a proof that says that it is this very specific superspace lattice. But the one that we use to describe the Fermi surface is the same construction I showed here. So this construction is a real space construction due to lattice mismatches. And our Fermi surface is a momentum space construction based on momentum mismatches, which we call the Moiré Q vector. And so by elevating the Fermi surface into one higher superspace dimension in this very simple way, then that gives us the right quantum oscillation frequencies.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions?
So a non-expert question. So on this slide, there's sort of 2 different senses of using a higher dimension. One is on the left, you're stacking the orange sheet and the purple sheet. That's slightly using the 3rd dimension because you're stacking one sheet on the other. And the other is on the right, the superspace argument, which you made. And the superspace argument, from what you said, there's a superspace argument that gives you the Penrose tiling.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So is there a Moiré-like construction of the Penrose tiling? By which I mean, is there a way of stacking periodic things like graphene layers, stacking them in the way that you're doing in the lab, and getting the Penrose tiling? So stacking periodic things, but then getting the Penrose tiling.
So my understanding is I don't know of a way to do it with hexagonal lattices for Penrose tiling, but there are quasi-crystals. So these are the systems that I showed before. The Penrose tiling is a version where the bonding configuration changes as a function of space. There are quasi-crystals that you can generate with like twisted graphene structures. So there's some interesting work from Pablo's group and here, but there's also interesting work that you can image what's called 30-degree twisted graphenes. You'll see essentially a system. In 2 dimensions you can get a 1-fold symmetry, 2-fold, 4-fold, and 6-fold symmetry, but you can construct an object that looks like it's 12-fold symmetric, inheriting its superspace or projecting its superspace dimensions to get a approximate C12 symmetry that again you can't resolve here. But the Penrose crystal, I think I just use it as a interesting example. It's one of the very first that people understood actually had this higher dimensional structure, and it has this clean. The Penrose crystal has this 5-fold looking symmetry in its diffraction, or 10-fold symmetry, I can't remember which one, and that's inherited from that 5-dimensional cubic lattice that it is a slice of, yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, let's thank Kevin again.
Thank you.